Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to men. For this, he was tortured for eternity. Nailed to a mountain, his liver was devoured each day by an eagle. Each night, it grew back. J. Robert Oppenheimer was born on April 22, 1904, in New York City. The J, which Robert throughout his life insisted stood for nothing at all, actually stood for Julius. Robert grew up largely by his mother's side, limiting his social interactions and leaving him with just one friend by his mid-teens. In 1912, when Robert was 8, Ella gave birth to Frank Friedman Oppenheimer. Because of the age gap, there was little chance of sibling rivalry. The boys got along well. Robert, later joined by Frank, attended the Ethical Culture School in New York. This institution emphasized progressive education. Robert excelled at ethical culture. His academic prowess led to advanced studies in physics and chemistry by 5th grade. Robert later titled himself a repulsively good little boy. His education through the school is certainly the backbone of his lifelong left-wing ideologies. In 1921, Robert graduated from the Ethical Culture School. To celebrate, he and a teacher from Ethical Culture went on a trip to the American Southwest. The two men gradually made their way across New Mexico. It was here that Robert would fall in love with New Mexico, with its vast natural beauty and ample room for horse riding. "My two great loves are physics and New Mexico. It's a pity they can't be combined," Robert wrote. In September of 1922, Robert enrolled at Harvard. After committing to a chemistry major, Robert realized that, although he enjoyed it, he liked physics more. He started taking advanced courses in physics and fell in love. He thrived in this field. When Danish Nobel Prize-winning physicist Niels Bohr visited Harvard in 1923, Robert made sure to attend both of his lectures. Bohr was a prominent figure in Robert's life, his biggest inspiration. At 19, Robert was a handsome young man. 5'10", but never more than 130 pounds, he was very lanky. His hair was long and curly on the top and short on the sides. His eyes were piercingly blue. Despite this, he had no relationships with any women. "My feeling about myself," he later wrote, "was always one of extreme discontent." Nevertheless, Robert continued working hard. After just 3 years at Harvard, he graduated with a bachelor's degree in chemistry. Knowing that he was much more interested in physics, he was unsatisfied with this degree. He wanted to continue schooling. Robert decided that Cambridge University in England was his best bet. After applying, he spent his summer back in New Mexico. It was probably on one of his horse rides there that Robert smoked his first tobacco, which would become a lifelong addiction. When Robert returned, he found that he had been accepted to Cambridge. He was ready to take his future to Europe. After a boat trip east and a coastal vacation with Francis, Robert arrived at Cambridge. Robert's time at Cambridge was miserable. He was in another depressed state. He hated his life so much that he may have injected poison into the apple of his head tutor. Thankfully, the apple was discovered. This event, however, is highly debated as to whether it even happened. After a life-altering vacation, something changed in Robert. He returned to Cambridge with a better outlook on life. He started doing theoretical work rather than lab work, which he enjoyed greatly. Robert finally met his idol Niels Bohr personally. He also met a foreign professor named Max Born. Born taught theoretical physics at the University of Göttingen in Germany. He asked Robert to come to Göttingen to study. Robert started at Göttingen in 1926. He absolutely loved his life there. It was heaven in comparison to Cambridge. At Göttingen, Robert met Werner Heisenberg, a German physicist who had attended. Heisenberg had been a lead role in developing quantum mechanics, and was a large inspiration for Robert. Robert never could have known that a few years later, they would be competing head-to-head in the creation of the atomic bomb. After just 9 months flourishing at Göttingen, Robert was awarded his doctorate in theoretical physics. He accepted a position at the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech, so he moved to Pasadena to teach theoretical physics. His educating there went well, even uneventfully. In the summers, Robert and Frank went on trips to New Mexico. On one such vacation, they were offered a ranch that was for sale. They convinced their father to purchase it. Perro Caliente Ranch remains in the family to this day. Robert accepted a position at the University of California, Berkeley. Here, he met Ernest Lawrence, an experimental physicist. They quickly became great friends. When Robert arrived, Lawrence had been working on a new invention, a particle accelerator. Robert was also working on something big at Berkeley. He had often wondered about what happens when a star dies. He theorized that when a star ran out of fuel, it would indefinitely collapse in on itself. The gravity would increase, which would increase density, which would increase gravity again. The cycle would continue to the point that everything around the star would be sucked in, including light. His paper on this occurrence was published in 1931. It wasn't until 1968 that the common name of these dead stars would be coined, a black hole. Robert was not a very politically active man until his time at Berkeley. Robert met Håkon Chevalier, a good friend who would later cripple Robert's legacy forever. He also met Jean Tatlock. Jean was a beautiful young lady, much like Robert. They both loved poetry and philosophy. Physics was more of Robert's thing. They shared very similar political views. Jean joined the Communist Party USA. The pair fell in love and started dating. Jean, like Robert in the past, had many bouts of depression. This caused difficulty in the relationship. However, it held until 1939, albeit on and off. Around 1936, Frank Oppenheimer was married. He and his wife Jackie joined the Communist Party. Robert, although surrounded by communists and heavily in favor of their views, never actually became a member. He continued mingling, though. While at a social gathering, he met a 29-year-old woman named Catherine Kitty Harrison. Kitty was a pretty young woman from Germany. She had moved to the US when she was 2 and lived with a wealthy family in Pittsburgh. She had been married thrice before. When Robert invited Kitty to come to New Mexico, she was unfaithful to her husband. By the end of the summer, Kitty was pregnant. The very day she was divorced, she was remarried to Robert. The newlyweds relocated near Berkeley campus and settled into their new life. Their son Peter was born on May 12, 1941. The newspaper on January 29, 1939, brought a revelation to the world of science. It informed that 2 German chemists had split the uranium atom. This is known as nuclear fission. Every physicist in the world knew immediately that this power could be used to make bombs. It took a while for the US government to consider the creation of an atomic bomb. It wasn't until 1942, nearly 3 years after the discovery of fission, that work was started. Robert was a well-known leader in quantum mechanics, so it was no surprise that he was involved with the work. By September, many in the government believed Robert Oppenheimer to be the best man to lead a development project on the bomb. There was one problem, however: Robert's many communist ties. The army refused to issue him a security clearance. However, leaders of the project pursued Robert. They convinced the issuing of his clearance. Colonel Leslie R. Groves was put in charge of finding the Manhattan Project's director. He had previous experience overseeing the creation of the Pentagon building, making him a great choice to lead this new atomic bomb program. Groves was a no-nonsense man. He was straightforward to the point that few liked him, and he was equally selective about the company he kept. Robert was an exception. Groves knew that Robert was a genius and selected him as the Manhattan Project's director. Robert immediately got to work. He needed a remote location to build this bomb. Recalling his sentiment of combining physics and New Mexico, Robert and a team started exploring the state for a perfect spot. They finally found it at Los Alamos, an isolated mesa with a gorgeous view. Robert and Groves each got what they wanted. He and Groves traveled the country hiring physicists for their new project. It was a tough ask. Not many would want to relocate their entire life and family to a secret location for a project unrevealed until arrival. Nevertheless, the 2 men pulled it off. After just 4 months, in March 1943, the town of Los Alamos had been constructed, and the 30 scientists there got to work. It was around this time that Robert hosted dinner for his friends, the Chevaliers. As Robert was making martinis for his guests, Håkon Chevalier mentioned something extremely peculiar. He explained a conversation he had with a man who requested Chevalier to inform Robert about an opportunity to share information with a Soviet intelligence officer. Robert was immediately taken aback. Robert never took up on the offer, but he didn't report it either. In fact, he lied about this occurrence to Colonel Boris Pash, creating a cock and bull story that was entirely false. This occurrence didn't stir up any trouble, at least not yet. At first, Robert was a rather overbearing director. Many had their doubts about him being the right man for the job. Robert had to change, and he did. He quickly became an incredibly charismatic and efficient leader. People idolized Robert. "He'd make you do the impossible," one scientist stated. Robert cut his long, curly hair extremely short, and his messy desk at Berkeley turned into a neatly organized one at Los Alamos. In June 1943, Robert visited Jean Tatlock, his ex-lover. He had been seeing her, despite his marriage to Kitty, multiple times a year. This visit was monitored, unbeknownst to Robert. Since Tatlock was a Communist Party member, Robert visiting her privately ruffled some feathers. But this 1943 visit was the last time Robert ever saw Tatlock. On January 4th, 1944, Tatlock was found dead in her apartment. Jean had committed suicide. Robert was heavily shaken by Jean's death. He believed himself to be a part of the reason she had died. On December 7th, 1944, Catherine Oppenheimer was born. Robert and Kitty nicknamed her Tony. Kitty was no better with Tony than with Peter. In fact, she favored Peter greatly. Kitty started drinking heavily. Robert, a busy man, could only see Tony a couple times a week. Robert did his best as a father, but his overloading work schedule made it difficult to be attentive. The bomb, or gadget, as they started calling it, was coming along nicely. After a year, there were over 1,000 people working at Los Alamos. Uranium and plutonium, the core elements of the bomb, were slowly being processed, and ideas of how to form the gadget were discussed. In the end, it was decided that the bomb would be detonated by shooting uranium into a plutonium core, creating an implosion device that would start nuclear fission. Edward Teller discovered the possibility of igniting the Earth's atmosphere with even just a fission explosion. This possibility was determined to be near zero, but not impossible. Despite this, work on the bomb progressed. The month of April 1945 was eventful. On the 12th, Franklin Roosevelt passed away, and into office came Harry Truman. As well as this, the 30th brought the suicide of Adolf Hitler. These developments in the world, especially the surrendering of Nazi Germany, brought a question: do we continue building the bomb? Many at Los Alamos questioned the purpose. Germany was no longer a threat. Even so, production went on. Robert voiced no retaliations to continuing the project. He attended the meeting that chose where the next target would be, and he agreed upon Japan. At that meeting, it was decided the bomb would be dropped onto a Japanese city without warning. By June 1945, the gadget was nearly ready. "Batter my heart, three-person to God," was the line of poetry in which Robert chose for the name of the gadget test site, Trinity. July 16th was the chosen date of the test. Finally, after 3 years of long hours, intense labor, and seclusion, the bomb was ready. "You can change the sheets," is what Robert would tell Kitty if the test went well. He became extremely nervous, understandably, on the days prior to the test. That near-zero chance that the bomb would ignite the atmosphere and kill everyone and everything certainly didn't help his anxiety. On the day before the test, Robert visited the Trinity Tower, where the bomb was being held, ready to be dropped. He climbed up all 100 feet of the tower, alone, taking one last look at his creation. Was it worth it? The biggest feat in science's history, used to decimate hundreds of thousands of people. It is understandable why Isidore Rabi decided to stay out of the Manhattan Project. You drop a bomb and it falls on the just and the unjust. At 5:10 a.m., a voice echoed over the loudspeaker, "T-minus 20 minutes." Everyone was given a welder's glass and told to only look at the explosion through it. Robert was situated in a bunker about 5 miles from the Trinity site, while others outside were no closer than 10 miles. The countdown drew closer and closer to zero. At 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the sun was brought to Earth. The story of Prometheus was retold. The very fire of the sky was now in the hands of men. A white light blinded onlookers as it turned into an orange pillar in the sky. All was silent.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
The column of smoke and fire rose up 30,000 feet in the sky, spreading out like a mushroom at the top. After a full minute and a half, a violent, deafening shockwave dropped onlookers to their knees. The sand of the New Mexico desert filled the air. All Robert managed to say was, "It worked." His fears and anxieties were halted for those staggering few minutes. It worked. Prometheus had successfully stolen fire from the gods, but the second half of his story was coming soon. An overwhelming sense of victory filled the air back at Los Alamos. The men vigorously shook hands, slapped each other on the back, danced, and laughed. Robert asked his secretary to send a message to Kitty. Tell her she can change the sheets. But that sentiment didn't last long. The euphoric feeling of victory soon passed, and in came a horrible dread onto Robert. He was found in his office, chain-smoking, uttering, "Those poor little people." He was referring to the Japanese. Nevertheless, Robert participated in more meetings on where to drop the bomb. They eventually chose Hiroshima, an important military and economic hub on the island of Tinian. Hiroshima had a large population of about 300,000, and with its significance in the economy and military, it was a prime target for a bombing. On August 6, 1945, the second ever nuclear bomb was used. Within seconds, Hiroshima was entirely devastated. Buildings, animals, and people were turned to dust. 3 days later, the industrial city of Nagasaki was handed the same fate. After the bombings, Robert became a much more somber man. Those poor little people, needlessly killed. The Allies had practically already won the war. The bombings killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people. Most were civilians. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were decimated. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was finally over. Robert's depression had reemerged. Robert had spent 3 years of his life creating a device to decimate as many people as possible. After the war, Robert had become a celebrity. He was the most respected scientist in the world. His face filled the cover of a Time magazine issue. Robert accepted this fame. He was labeled the father of the atomic bomb. He also stated how he truly felt about his gadget. "We have made a thing, a most terrible weapon." At this point, Robert was much more of a background character in the story of the atomic bomb. He had done his duty, but now his work was done, and the power he had over the bomb was practically gone. The only control Robert had was his fame and influence. After his resignation from the Manhattan Project, Robert had become an influential figure in Washington, D.C. He was a member of Harvard's Board of Overseers. He also stepped in as the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, chairman of the General Advisory Board. In this, he lobbied against the creation of a hydrogen bomb, which would be thousands of times stronger than an atomic bomb. In the AEC worked Lewis Strauss. He was on the board of trustees at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Although not connected to Princeton University, the institute was a renowned center for intelligent minds. It was the extremely prestigious home of Albert Einstein. Strauss explained how they were looking for a new director, and Robert's name was at the top of the list. After mulling it over for a few months, Robert accepted the job, and the Oppenheimers moved to Princeton. But Lewis Strauss was upset. Strauss had offered Robert one of the most prestigious jobs in the world, and he took months to accept it. Strauss had access to Robert's file, and despite his issues, he still offered him the position. How dare he take so long to accept it? Strauss was a very opinionated man. The Oppenheimers moved into Olden Manor, a mansion on the Institute campus. The Institute was not a college. There were no students, and no courses were taught. Rather, it was a center for intelligent minds. Robert wanted to expand this greatly, and recruited many physicists to reside at the Institute from time to time. including Niels Bohr and Paul Dirac, founders of quantum mechanics. While Robert continued to grow the institute, Lewis Strauss remained on the board of trustees. Strauss wanted to become chairman of the board. Robert, knowing of Strauss' political views, denied this. A sort of feud was brewing between the two men, and Strauss' rejection certainly didn't help it. Back and forth they went, creating a bigger and bigger rivalry. By the 50s, many people from Robert's left-wing past, including Håkon Chevalier and Robert's own brother Frank, were becoming victims of the McCarthy era. Former students, friends, and colleagues of Robert were practically banished due to their left-wing ideologies. A lot of these men lost their jobs and were practically exiled from the public eye. Many hearings were held to banish these commies. Frank Oppenheimer was forced to resign from his position teaching physics at the University of Minnesota. He couldn't find a job anywhere. His only option was to become a rancher in Colorado, wasting his brilliant potential over his political views. Robert, surprisingly, was unharmed. Continually, the feud between Strauss and Robert grew. Meanwhile, more and more left-wing Americans were being hunted down and destroyed, politically and socially. Lives were ruined by McCarthyism. Lewis Strauss wanted it to be Robert's turn. With the rise of anti-communist hysteria in America, Strauss had his chance to win the ever-growing feud against Robert Oppenheimer. Strauss began his campaign on May 25, 1953. He met with one of the aides of the FBI director. Strauss shared more information against Robert, adding to his already 8,000-page long FBI file. That afternoon, he met with President Eisenhower and explained his reasons on why Robert did not belong in the AEC. In July of 1953, Strauss was appointed chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. Now head of the AEC, Strauss had even more control. But he couldn't just kick Robert out, so on his campaign went. The next step in Strauss' crusade was making a deal with William Borden. Borden was the staff director for the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy. He shared Strauss' animosity toward Robert. Strauss offered Borden an accord. Borden would write a report heavily against Robert, and Strauss would supply him with classified information from Robert's security file. Over the coming months, Strauss and Borden prepared a full-scale assault against Robert. When it was finished, Borden's report was a mere 3.5 pages long document designed only to destroy Robert. More probably than not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is an agent of the Soviet Union. The report was sent to the FBI, where it prompted even more addition to Robert's file. Strauss' final and most brutal step was revoking Robert's governmental security clearance. He went to the Oval Office, who authorized him to give Robert a choice: either leave the AEC quietly or appeal his revocation in front of a board appointed by Strauss. He met with Robert to break the news. Strauss curiously left out his role in the matter, that he had helped bring the charges alongside Borden. Robert chose to appeal the decision to revoke his security clearance. Strauss' panel was not court. They weren't convicting Robert, just denying his security clearance. He wouldn't go to jail if found guilty for his metaphorical crimes. Nevertheless, the security hearing was just as intense as court. Corruption littered Robert's hearing. However, since it wasn't a governmental court case, there was nothing Robert could do. Strauss had complete control. During his hearing, Robert was ripped apart. Robert had so many communist ties, there was very little chance he could escape. The entire hearing took 4 weeks. Robert spent 27 hours in the witness chair and was forced to watch the rest. On May 6, 1954, the hearing was concluded. By a vote of 2-1, Robert was denied his security clearance. Strauss had won. Prometheus had his glory and was now chained to his rock and tortured. Robert lost his entire role in the government. Even when hundreds of scientists signed a letter trying to convince the AEC to give Robert his clearance back, it didn't work. Strauss next tried to strip Robert of his directorship at the Institute, but before he could, every single member of the Institute faculty signed a letter in favor of Robert. Despite the loads of support he had, Robert had lost. In 1958, the Oppenheimers had a home built on a small island called St. John in the Virgin Islands. It was their getaway. They continually spent more and more time there. Peter, unfortunately, did not. He grew further and further from his mother, and rightfully so. He continued his life in New Mexico at Perro Caliente Ranch. In 1959, Louis Strauss had his own downfall. President Eisenhower invited Louis to become a member of the U.S. cabinet. However, after testimony by physicist David Hill, Strauss' reputation was ruined.
The views I have to express are my own, but I believe that much I have to say will help to indicate why most of the scientists in this country would prefer to see Mr. Strauss completely out of government.
After Hill's testimony, Strauss became the first person in 34 years and the 9th person ever to be rejected from the cabinet. Strauss' career was over. Nevertheless, the damage had been done and Robert was still excommunicated. John F. Kennedy was one of the nays to Strauss' nomination in support of Robert. In 1963, Robert was awarded the Enrico Fermi Award. Kennedy was assassinated before he could present it to Robert. President Lyndon B. Johnson took his place. 1965 brought Robert's retirement from the Institute. Construction on a new house, funded by the Institute, started, but Robert never got to live in it. In early 1966, Robert was diagnosed with inoperable throat cancer. He had been a chain smoker since the 20s and had only recently retired to just a pipe, but his habits finally caught up with him. Robert grew paler and became very weak. He lost nearly all his hearing and mumbled even worse than he often did already. Robert's lifelong best friend, Francis Ferguson, visited him on February 17th, 1967. After one final chat with his best friend, on February 18th, 1967, J. Robert Oppenheimer passed away. On a stormy afternoon, Kitty, Tony, and a few friends drove a motorboat out to sea, near their St. John home. Kitty didn't scatter Robert's ashes. She dropped the urn overboard and watched as it slowly sank. Kitty Oppenheimer passed away in 1972. Tony Oppenheimer stayed at St. John and made it her home until she hanged herself in 1977. Frank Oppenheimer was able to come back from his communist expulsion. He passed away in 1985. Peter Oppenheimer lives in seclusion in New Mexico to this day. It wasn't until 2022 that the fateful 1954 security clearance decision was revoked. This didn't do much. Robert had been dead for 55 years. Robert Oppenheimer left behind a legacy of extreme triumph as well as deep loss. His life was paradoxical. It is too simple to label him the father of the atomic bomb. Robert was much more than that. J. Robert Oppenheimer was an American Prometheus.